everyone, and welcome, and thank you for your interest and registration for the Consumer Involvement in Research webinar that we're conducting here at East Metropolitan Health Service. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are on, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and we pay our respects to their culture and their elders past and present. Moving on to some housekeeping notes, there's a Q&A button that you should see at the top of your screen, and this will be available throughout the webinar. Please feel free to type in any questions as the event progresses, and we will facilitate questions and answers with our panel of experts after a short break at the end of today's two presentations. Of course, I should have introduced myself. My name is Fatovich. I'm the Director of Research at East Metropolitan Health Service, and I will be moderating this webinar today. I'm not going to say much before I introduce our first speaker, but I do want to say that consumer involvement in research is, in my opinion, one of the best things to happen to research in the last 10 or so years. My experience has been incredibly positive, and I think for me it boils down fundamentally to the fact that involving consumers in research means that you're focusing on patient-oriented outcomes, which I think is really important and contributes, therefore, heavily to research translation. Anyway, I'm going to move on and introduce you to our first speaker today, who's Ben Horgan, sitting next to me. Ben is currently working for the Royal Perth Bentley Group within East Metro as the Community Development Officer. Just a little bit about Ben. He was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis at the age of 2 and has spent his life within the health system. After a 10-year career as a radio announcer working across Australia, he began a career as a consumer advocate working in Sydney, Canberra and Perth. His current role at Royal Perth enables him to utilise all of his experience and evidence-based best practice models to improve collaboration between clinicians, researchers, service providers and health consumers within our community. The results will enable increased levels of involvement from health consumers and community, supporting the development and implementation of better healthcare practices, plus more relevant health research and increased rates of patient-centred health service delivery. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. This is a topic that I've been very passionate about. For most of my life, I was lucky enough to have a mum who was not only determined to make sure that my quality of life and my outcomes were as good as they could possibly be, but spent a lot of time helping others in a similar way, and pretty much became a researcher herself. So I followed in her footsteps and really enjoyed the opportunity to be able to work with some amazing researchers, some amazing consumers, and really seeing some terrific outcomes from the partnerships that have been developed. So I want to talk to you today a little bit about what consumer involvement in research is, as well as what it's not. But I thought it'd be nice to start with why it's actually important. And it seems like, well, from my point of view anyway, it might be a silly thing to say, but it seems pretty obvious that the reason you want to bring people into your research projects who have a lived experience around the topic that you're investigating is that it's really important to understand where are the opportunities to make a difference. Most consumers get into this sort of line of work because they've got through their own journey. They've reached a point where they actually want to use some of the lessons that they've learned and the activities that they've gone through to try and make a difference for others. So to bring those people in to help you to learn as a researcher, and also to help you answer the questions which are most important to people who are living with these conditions, seems like a no-brainer. Consumers have a different understanding as well, and they look at things in a completely different way. So as a clinician or a researcher, you've been educated in this world and you've been taught right from wrong, mainly from the evidence that has been around up until this point. Whereas consumers have lived it every minute of potentially their life. They've got out of bed in the morning, understanding what that feels like, and they've gone to bed at night with all sorts of experiences through the day, some of which work, some of which don't, some of which are incredibly frustrating. And all of that experience is totally different to the experiences that you might have as a researcher or a clinician. Thus, it's incredibly valuable to be able to influence the work that you're doing and also how you're going to do the work going forward as well. So that alternate view is imperative when you're pulling together a collaborative team. So you might think in the past a collaborative team would have been doctors and nurses and allied health professionals and maybe a health economist and a data statistician, but without the consumer in that team, you really are missing something that's incredibly important, and you won't even know it unless you actually include them. So we want to talk about what involvement is. So this is where people get stuck a lot of the time, because there's all sorts of ways that you can engage with the community and with people who have a lived experience, consumers, carers, and none of them are wrong. Anytime you get an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody who has a lived experience or a carer that's looking after them, then that conversation is going to be valuable. But partnership is really what it's all about. So it's not about those casual conversations. It's not about those presentations that you might give in a community setting. It's really about sitting down at a table or over a coffee and discussing opportunities that lie ahead. Maybe it's an idea that you've had. Maybe you're picking the brains of a consumer around ideas that they might have. And after that, it's about coming together in a partnership to be able to deliver research or to design and deliver research and work with the outcomes. So it's really important to have what we call a two-way conversation, and to invite consumers into your research teams is the best way to start that. Doesn't mean that you need to include them in every single meeting that you have about your research project. As a matter of fact, it's really important to plan where you're going to include them from the beginning so that they understand the commitment that they're getting into. But it is important at those times where you really do need to answer questions that they can be involved in, that they're at the table. And obviously there's different sorts of research, whether you're doing a basic science or a lab-based project, or whether it's a qualitative, quantitative, whatever the research is, there's different ways of involving consumers. And even though we mightn't have the time to go through all of those different ways today, there's all sorts of resources that we can point you to in a little while to talk to you about where you can find that information going forward. So I've touched on what involvement isn't, but we'll look at that a little bit more closely now. So participation is something that is intrinsic to all sorts of research, and participation is incredibly important to be able to get the information that you need to be able to come up with the outcomes that you're looking for. But participation isn't involvement. And I've seen many research applications that have talked about the fact that they're looking to gather about 100 or more participants into their research, and thus they're involving consumers in their work. Now, that doesn't work as far as involvement is concerned because of what I've already talked about. It's not a two-way conversation. It's really you're designing the protocols and you're asking the questions because you think that they're important. The consumers are answering them in the different ways that you include participants in your project. But it's really a one-way conversation, and there's no way to actually understand whether the questions that you're asking are relevant, whether the participation strategy that you've got is appropriate. And to be honest with you, most of the time I speak with researchers about the fact that they need more participants into their project and they don't know where to find them. The trouble actually started with the conversation around the methodology or setting the protocols, because they hadn't actually spoken to consumers about what that looked like. And even though we really want to be able to get some great power out of the data that we collect, sometimes it's not what consumers want to do. So it's really important to separate participation from involvement and get the involvement started before you even start thinking about your participation strategy, so that you set yourself up to succeed as much as possible. So things like the experiments and studies, surveys, focus groups, and all the sampling that you take from consumers, that's not involvement, just to be clear. That's participation, and that's totally different to what involvement is. Then there's consultation. So this is a trick that a lot of clinicians fall into, and I've spoken to many over the years who say, I see patients every day and I talk to them about what they're going through every day. I don't need to involve consumers in my research team because I know all of that information. But the problem with that is, of course, you're talking to them about their own specific issues, and you're talking to them about how you can best deliver the care that they require in the most appropriate way and deliver the outcomes that they're looking for about their care. You're not talking about a research project, and consumers aren't really understanding of the fact that you're going to take the information that they're providing you and then you're going to use it in another way to be able to design research. That's not appropriate, and it's also not fair to the funding body to say that, oh, I've spoken to my patients, they reckon this is a good idea, so I'm going to call that involvement. From doing a lot of panel work, you can tell pretty quickly when you're reading applications who's done involvement properly and who's talking about involvement in a way that they think you want them to, they want you to think that they've done it the right way. It doesn't work. You need to include consumers in your research team. You need to articulate what it is that they've told you about the work and why you're doing your work this way, so that you can demonstrate that you're doing true involvement. You've not just had a couple of conversations off to the side and you've included that in your research work to demonstrate involvement. It's cheating in a way, and it's not fair to the consumers who could really give you great information and add value to the work that you're doing. So if you think that presenting at research forums or conferences, or you're speaking at the local Rotary group, or your consults in your surgery involvement, I'm here to tell you that that's not quite right. That's what we might call consultation, but it certainly isn't involvement. So just to be clear, and Dan's already talked about the fact that over the last 10 years we've come a long way. If you think you can still get away with not including consumers in your research teams and you'll still probably get funded, I'm here to tell you you're probably wrong. So it could be an infinite list, to be honest with you, and there's more funding bodies coming up all the time that are asking you questions about how you've included people with lived experience, consumers, carers. There's many different terms that mean the same thing. If you're not including them in your team, you are putting yourself on the back foot as far as getting funded is concerned. The Cancer Council of Australia were probably the leaders in this space. They started this probably over 10 years ago now, and their funding model nowadays, so they score you on about 33% of your overall score comes from your consumer involvement strategy and the questions that you answer in their grant applications around consumer involvement. So you definitely put yourself on the back foot if you're looking to get any of the Cancer Council funding model programs going forward. But the Department of Western Australia, the Government of Western Australia Department of Health, through the Future Health Research and Innovation Fund, is also well and truly involving consumers in their funding models going forward, and they're looking at between 10, 15, sometimes a little bit more percent of their final score involving consumers in your applications. The Medical Research and Futures Fund, which I'm a member of their patient panel, are developing new ways to ensure that you are involving consumers in your research, and it's less likely to get funded through EMRF these days. And as you can see, there's others here, including our own Royal Perth Hospital Research Foundation, who are looking at their involvement questions as we speak and are refining them to ensure that there's better representation from consumers in the grants that they hand out these days. So you're just not putting yourself in the best position to be successful unless you're embracing consumer involvement in the work that you're doing going forward. So a lot of people want to know, well, how can consumers actually be involved, and what is it that they can actually contribute to the work? It's funny, when I first started doing this sort of work and helping researchers to involve consumers in research groups, I started off thinking that it was the consumers who were going to be quite intimidated and feel a little bit vulnerable in these conversations. But the longer I've been doing this work, the more I now understand that these two-way conversations is just as scary for researchers as it is for consumers. So if you're feeling like this is a bit of an intimidating place to be, you're not alone, and consumers understand that, and really all we want to be able to do is bring people together to add value to what could be outstanding research and get the results that everybody needs to be able to deliver better care. We're all in it for the same reasons, and sitting down, having a coffee and just a general conversation about what you want to do, I guarantee by the end of it, you'll wish you had done it sooner. So consumers are more than happy to help you to write your applications in a way that make them clear. So one of the things that the Cancer Council do, they actually they ask consumers to score your plain language summary or your lay summary of your work. But it's happening more across the board in other funding bodies as well. So getting your consumers to have a look at it and seeing if they can understand it is a great way for them to contribute to your work, because we all know that researchers speak a different language, Dan, and you need to be brought back to plain language from time to time, as hard as that might be for some of us. Being able to understand what difference the project will make. So that impact question, which we all struggle with from time to time, if a consumer can't tell you what the impact's going to be of the project, you probably need to have a look at your question, because it might mean that it's not really going to make a difference in their lives. And if it's not, it might be because it's too early on in the research phase, so it might be a basic science project, and that might be more about talking about the project and what it is that you're trying to accomplish down the track, or not even you down the track, but in several iterations time, what is it that this is actually going to do in the future? But really being able to say what difference this is going to make, consumers are great at doing that. That ties into the benefits to patients. So it might be something like I talked about before that you haven't even thought of. Patients can say, yeah, that's actually going to make a real difference in my life, because it means I'm going to be able to do this. Or, the side effects to the medications, if we can get rid of that, it means my daily life's going to take a totally different shape. And these are the things that patients can help you write into your applications. It's really going to make the difference to whether you potentially get funded or not. As I talked about before, your participation strategy. So what are you asking the patients to do? I see a lot of clinician researchers who actually think that it's fine to just ask the consumers or the patients to come into the hospital every other day to have a few extra tests, because they're used to coming into hospitals and it's not really going to make a big deal. I'm here to tell you, the last place on earth that most patients want to come to on another day is a hospital. So unless you actually talk to consumers about that, you mightn't actually know it. You might assume something and it might be totally opposite to what the reality is. So that's just one example. But the more you ask consumers to do, might make for great outcomes as far as you're concerned, but you're going to set yourself up to fail, because the consumers know, the patients know, nobody's going to really want to do that. So that line of questioning is really useful. And so we've talked about, will the research make a difference, but is it important to know what this question, the answer to what this question is trying to find out? So consumers want to be able to feel like they're making a difference. So what you're doing is new, innovative. It's actually going to be a game changer. Will it change the knowledge in this area? And I'll tell you what, consumers know more about the science than you give them credit for. Once somebody finds out that they've been diagnosed with something they've never heard of before, they become an instant expert overnight. Dr. Google is not our friend, don't get me wrong, but there's so many ways these days for people to find out about what's going on in a particular area, and patients do that. They go home and they do their homework. Their parents do the homework, or the children of an elderly person who's been diagnosed with something. The family gets on board right away. And if there's new knowledge that needs to be known, consumers will tell you about it pretty quickly. And then getting back, so closing the loop, we call it, getting back to the community and helping them to understand what research is going on. We don't do a great job of promoting the amazing work that we do in this state, let alone in this country. We've got some amazingly smart people, and I bet you most of you listening to this today don't understand how clever you are, but we don't promote ourselves well enough at all. If you bring consumers into your team and you allow them to become a true partner in the work that you're doing, they'll spruik it to everybody. They'll help you tell the world about the amazing work that you're doing, and that gives you a great opportunity to be able to get out into the community and tell them more about what you're doing and gain interest. Potentially you could be gaining more participants into your research project because your partners are out there telling everybody about what a great project you're doing. But you could also use them with their links to NGOs and other funding bodies to get your name a bit more exposure. So the next time you go out and you put another research application in, because of the work of your consumers spreading your name, they might know you and they might know the great work that you're doing somewhere else or in another field, and that might put you in a better place as well. So allowing consumers to sell the products that you're developing, or talk about the work that you're doing, is highly valuable as well. So just quickly to look at what good consumer involvement looks like in an application, because I know this is somewhere where we fall down a little bit. Most applications have a question where they ask you about your consumer involvement, and that's where you brain dump all of the things that your consumers have helped you to do. I'm here to tell you that if you want to get good marks in this space from the panels that I've been on, you're better off putting throughout your application how consumers have informed each component of that application. So starting off with why you're answering this question, or if you're able to identify some prioritisation work that's been done in the past, and there's all sorts of different bodies of work out there where consumers have informed priorities around research topics. If you can show that your question has come out of one of these priority setting projects, that's a great way to demonstrate that consumers have informed why you're doing this work. Even the consumers on your team, if you can take a quote from them in answering why this question is important, then it'll make people who are assessing the application aware from the very beginning that this is being done because the people who you're trying to help have told you that it needs to be done. So designing the research project as well, try and articulate how the consumers have helped you to design the methodology or the protocol. Why are you doing it this way? Well, the consumers have said that this is the best way to be able to get the outcomes that we're looking for. As I've said before, your plain language summary, make sure that it is plain language. So it's generally talked about, if a 12-year-old can understand what you're writing about, that's plain language. And practice it sometimes on your relatives, so your grandma or your granddad or your own children. Read them what you're putting in as your lay summary, and if they go, oh, that's really interesting, you've hit the mark. If they look at you like you're speaking double Dutch, then maybe you need to have a look at it and get your consumers in to help you rewrite it. A trick for new players, consumers need to get paid for the work and for the time that they're putting in. So honorariums are what they're called. It's recommended by the NHMRC and the Medical Research Futures Fund. The Health Consumers Council of WA has some guidelines around this. Include the financial commitment within your budget, because it's all well and good to talk about how you want to include consumers in your work, but if you don't budget for it, then funders will think, they're talking the talk, but are they walking the walk? And you will get marked down if you're not budgeting for a suitable consumer involvement. And then if you can talk about how the consumers are going to be involved in advocacy work for you. So with the recommendations that you potentially come up with, how are the consumers going to be involved in influencing policy and practice, whether it's within a hospital or at a department level? How can you involve your consumers in making sure that the impact of the work is actually picked up quicker than the 16 or 17 years that it takes for us to change best practice models these days? And then, as I said, throughout your application, you've shown how consumers have informed the work that you're going to do, but then articulate how the consumers will be involved through your research process as well, from informing your ethics application to developing your protocols, through to analysing your data, and then once again advocating for change once you've got your recommendations. If you can articulate across all of those areas within your application, you set yourself up to really score highly in your consumer involvement component, and all sorts of funding bodies have been able to demonstrate that the higher the score in consumer involvement, the more likely you are to get funded these days, whether it's a 33% score or a 10% score. The higher that score, the better chance you've got of being funded going forward. So just a few resources before I finish up. A local organisation, the Consumer and Community Involvement Program, which is linked to the WA Health Translation Network. They have a free e-course which is available for you to do at any time, and that QR code will take you straight there. It's a terrific, very short little program. You'll probably hear a few of the things we've spoken about here today included in that, but I highly recommend that. The NH and MRC have some really detailed documents that they're updating all the time within their web pages about us, and then consumer and community involvement. You'll find some fantastic resources there. And as I said, MREF are also improving their consumer involvement requirements within their grants, but they're also putting together principles for consumer involvement in research. And I think you'll find those quite interesting as well. And that's probably the newest resource that was released only about a month or two ago. So those and many more are available. If you were to Google consumer and community involvement, you'll find all sorts of different opportunities to get some more resources. But I'm available, as Dan has said, through the Royal Perth Bentley Group. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm sure you'll be able to find me somehow, and it will be my pleasure to be able to help you going forward. But thanks for joining us today, and I hope that you've got a little bit out of that and you'll enjoy the panel discussion to come.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben, for that great overview of consumer involvement in research. The only other thing that I'm going to add is that I'm now aware of some journals who will not send out your original research manuscript for review if you do not have a consumer as a part of the investigator team. So that's an important little bit of information. Let's move on to our next presenter, Stephen Macdonald, who's going to talk about his experience of consumer involvement in research. So Stephen is an emergency physician at Royal Perth Hospital and a clinical associate professor at UWA, and his research is focused on improving the recognition of sepsis, which affects an estimated 50,000 people each year in Australia. He leads a multidisciplinary research team based at the Centre for Clinical Research in Emergency Medicine within the Harry Perkins Institute of Medical Research. He's a co-lead investigator of the ARISE Fluence multi-centre clinical trial involving patients with septic shock across Australia and New Zealand. And he's the clinical lead for sepsis care within the East Metropolitan Health Service. He's contributed to the Sepsis National Action Plan and is involved in work to implement national care standards for sepsis in Australia, and has also been recognised internationally by the Global Sepsis Alliance for his research and advocacy work. He believes that the key to improving outcome for patients with sepsis involves improving the coordination of sepsis care across the patient journey. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Ben. And I'm really pleased to see that some of the things that you mentioned in your talk are also in my notes to talk about, so to know that we're on the same page. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk just very briefly for a few minutes just about my own experience as a researcher, about involving consumers in my research over the last few years, and hopefully some of the practical issues around that, and also how I believe it's added value to the enterprise we're involved in. As Daniel says, I do research in sepsis. Sepsis is a condition which has high mortality and significant long-term morbidity, and also significant cost to the health system. So it's a major public health issue. One of the particular challenges of sepsis research is patients often present very unwell and need to be enrolled in research early in their clinical course when they're not in a position to provide their own consent, and often when their family members are being confronted by a critically ill family member and discussions around consent. And I think that's important just for understanding that one of the ways that we involve consumers in particularly overcoming those challenges. So a few years ago, we were setting up our randomized clinical trial, the ARISE Fluids trial, which is looking at resuscitation strategies in septic shock, and we realised that we wanted to involve consumers in that. So we went about that in a couple of ways. There's an organisation called Sepsis Australia, based over in Sydney, but it's really the national peak body for sepsis, and they actually have a very engaged network of people with lived experience of sepsis and their families. So that was a port of contact for us, and we met some really made some really good contacts through that. Also locally, the WHTN has the organisation involving consumers in research, and we approached them, and they were able to facilitate what they call a community conversation, which is where they bring together researchers and put a call out through their network to bring patients and family members through, and then we have a facilitated discussion in a room just around a table like this, really about talking about some of the priorities for research. So that was just how we sort of got started with doing this. When to involve consumers in research? Well, I would totally reiterate what Ben said is around, it really is at all phases across the research journey, really starting from priority setting. What are the things that we should be researching? In planning our project and in designing our project, and the methodology around that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Involving patients in grant writing, particularly around the lay summaries and so on. And I would actually say what we have done, and I think what many people do, is actually involving consumer representatives as members of your research team on the management committee as associate investigators, and really all through that whole project life cycle. What are the specific things that we can ask consumers to do? Well, one of them is helping us to establish what our outcomes are for our trial. So one example is in our sepsis trial, one of the outcome measures we looked at, are interested in looking at, is days alive out of hospital at 90 days. So that's, from our point of view, very easy to calculate. We just say, well, we take 90 days after enrolment and subtract the amount of time the patient spent in the acute hospital bed. But of course, many patients leave the acute hospital and spend, some time in rehab, often many weeks. And when we spoke to consumers, they said, well, actually, what matters to me is not when I leave Royal Perth Hospital, it's when I'm actually back home sleeping in my own bed. So it's incumbent on us to actually look at those transition points in time and actually calculate days alive at home rather than days alive at a hospital. Understanding some of the burdens that we're asking patients to, research participants to take, and bringing patients back to hospital, for example, for follow-up interviews. Looking at some of our consumer-facing materials, so our patient information consent form, publicity materials, case summaries and grant applications. Justifying consent waivers, particularly in critical illness research or patients who can't capacity. It's very helpful for us when we went to the ethics committee and said we actually want to enrol patients who can't consent in research. This is important to actually have testimonials from people with lived experience saying this is actually important and we support this as consumers. That's very valuable. And finally, the dissemination and translation of findings into practice. Our patients are our biggest flag wavers when it comes to supporting and getting public, and often the media and decision makers and policy makers are much more interested in talking to people with lived experience of conditions than to talking to academics and to clinicians. So really, some of the nuts and bolts, I think as Ben's alluded to, absolutely imperative you include this in your budget as a line item, and that we do need to be respectful of the time commitment that we're asking people to give up. I think we also need to be respectful of that some of the discussions that we have in our meetings might be sort of quite technical and esoteric, and we need to be, respectful about how we use the consumers and make sure their time is best used. I think we also need to understand that our patient representatives are people who have a condition. They're not people who are defined by their condition, and we need to consider our patient representatives in our studies as fellow members of the team who are bringing specific expertise, just as we would a statistician or a health economist, for that example. And I think the other thing is again, particularly some conditions, patients may have experienced quite traumatic experiences, and so making sure that their psychological safety and following up and all of those kind of things as well. So just ensuring that there's a sort of perhaps a debrief afterwards and an opportunity to ask questions, and making sure that that relationship is actually is strong and bi-directional and respectful. So in summary, I think partnering with consumers adds significant value to research. That's certainly been my experience, but it needs to be done in the right way. Consumers have important roles to play at every stage of the project lifecycle, from planning, design, implementation, and dissemination. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen, for that very helpful and practical overview of consumer involvement in research. The only other thing I'm going to add is if you actually organise a community consultation, which I highly recommend, that is something that you can actually put together and publish, and then you can cite that publication in support of your grant application, which to my mind adds strength to the quality of the application. All right, we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who's going to talk about her experience engaging consumers in research from the perspective of someone who's actually quite new to the area of health research, and that's Aleesha. So Aleesha has a background as a physiotherapist with 7 years experience working clinically in the WA health system, including 6 years in East Metro and 1 year in Waits. Aleesha also spent a year in London working as a physiotherapist in the EMHS. Throughout her career, she's been involved in some smaller quality improvement activities, but has had limited experience with more formal research. In January this year, Aleesha began her current role as a project officer within the Health in a Virtual Environment, the HIVE team. One of her current projects with HIVE includes the Community Health in a Virtual Environment, called HIVE, which is a mental health research project. This was her first time being heavily involved in a formal research activity, in which she's very active in consumer involvement during the data collection and analysis phase of the project. So thanks, Aleesha.
Thanks, Daniel. Hello, everyone. I'm Aleesha, and I, as Daniel said, am a member of the HIVE Mental Health Research Project team. So this project has partnered with consumers to co-design and trial a model of care where mental health consumers could be assessed and monitored virtually. The involvement of consumers and consumer advocates in the research commenced in the very early stages of planning and conception back in 2021, so well before I became a part of the team, but all credit largely goes to them, I'd say. The HIVE project utilised 2 key elements of consumer engagement in the first phase of research, and these 2 elements were establishing the HIVE community consultation group and performing a proof of concept in partnership with the consumers. So the first major step was establishing the HIVE community consultation group. This group brought together mental health experts, consumer advocates, and people within health policy and service development to be involved throughout the project. This group was chaired by a mental health lived experience consultant and comprised of members from a range of relevant WA organisations, including a mental health advocate and a lived experience consumer. This group has been engaged throughout the project with monthly meetings to collaborate, provide advice and consultation of key aspects of the research project. For example, providing guidance on language and wording to use when delivering information to consumers, and reviewing and contributing to consumer-facing materials. From my experience, the consumers that have been a part of this group have been genuinely interested in the outcomes and progress of the project. They're motivated to help in improving service delivery and outcome and supporting future consumers of the service. And the advice and knowledge they provide is highly practical, relevant, and sometimes things that can be easily overlooked by research and project teams. The second key element of consumer involvement was conducting a proof of concept with consumers as the first phase of the research. So the objective of the proof of concept was to investigate acceptability and utilisation of remote monitoring technology and virtual platforms for clinical care. The proof of concept involved 12 consumers with lived experience of a mental health condition who participated in trialling the technology and model of care. We trialled 2 different TGA-approved smartwatch devices and a smartphone application used to deliver standardised mental health outcome measures, as well as general mood and sleep logs. Data from the smartwatches and smartphone application were sent to the CoHIVE clinicians for monitoring and assessment. The participants also had scheduled weekly video calls with a clinician to check in and discuss their subjective and objective mental health data. Findings from the proof of concept showed that these participants had high utilisation rates with the technology. At the end of the trial, these participants were invited to attend a focus group feedback session, and themes of this feedback that from participants indicated that virtual appointments were beneficial to the convenience and comfort of being able to receive care in their own safe space. They also reported the virtual platform supported their engagement with the service, a powerful finding considering the prevalence of disengagement with community mental health services. Data collection and visualisation through remote monitoring was another positive aspect according to these participants. This reportedly improved their self-awareness, leading to positive behaviour changes and improved health outcomes. Conducting a proof of concept that partnered with consumers was highly beneficial and helped us to then refine and redesign the model of care that we use in our pilot service. So the pilot service was implemented as an RCT, comparing treatment as usual with 2 levels of interventions based on the CoHIVE model of care. Participants were referred and recruited through community mental health services within the East Metro area. Eligible consumers were randomly allocated to one of 3 study groups and monitored for up to 10 weeks. The pilot service concluded in April this year, and participants were again offered to take part in feedback sessions to share their experience. Some of these sessions were also co-facilitated with the community consultation group chair and lived experience consultant, enabling a comfortable and judgment-free environment for the consumer to share their honest feedback. Final analysis and evaluation of the pilot is still in progress. However, early qualitative findings reflect similar positive themes that we found in the proof of concept. Establishing the community consultation group and partnering with consumers for the proof of concept were highly important in the success of the pilot service. We knew that consumer experience and service satisfaction is and would be vital to engagement and participation. As health service providers, we also know that participation and engagement is essential for the delivery of care and will ultimately support better outcomes for the consumers. From my experience, having consumers involved in this project made complete sense and significantly helped to tailor the service to their needs. As a clinician, this patient-centred care is something that I also value highly. The regular consumer input and insight we receive throughout the project provide very useful and practical guidance when designing a new service. As we approach completion of the project, our next phase of work is translating this research to service delivery, in which we will continue to be guided by our consumer groups. As someone new to the research field, it's been a valuable experience being involved in a highly consumer-focused research project. Transitioning from a clinical role, I've predominantly observed service improvement developed through a top-down approach, with the consumer's needs and preferences considered much later in the process. Taking a patient or consumer-centred approach early on in the research ensures that consumers are going to receive interventions tailored to their needs and supporting better health outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Aleesha, and obviously your recent lived experience of involving consumers in research has been very positive.
Yeah, it's doing great.
We're now going to introduce you to our final panel member, Leana Stendell. So Leana survived septic shock from a group A strep infection which developed in the last stages of pregnancy. Since her recovery and discharge from hospital 4 years ago, she's been involved in the consumer involvement groups and given talks on sepsis recovery and the journey through the health system. Recently, she's been involved in the East Metro Sepsis Working Group and has given feedback on various studies involving post-sepsis care. And certainly I've had several interactions with Leana and I've always found her involvement both impressive and inspiring. So Leana, please tell us about yourself and how you got involved as a consumer representative.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me, oh, there I am. So I initially got involved in consumer, probably from a pretty egotistical perspective actually. I was lying in hospital and my situation sucked and I wanted to tell my story, stop this happening to somebody else. So I had a lot of free time on my hands. Rehab can be a little bit boring, so I joined the Australian Sepsis Network and just do online calls. And then I was actually thinking about this, Stephen. I don't even know how I came to do that World Sepsis Day event. I think my parents came to your Arise chat, and I was in Royal Perth still at that time. And so I met Stephen really, and he's been my biggest fan. I feel like during this whole period. And now I started doing work with the East Metro Sepsis Working Group because I wanted to help and I wanted to make a difference. But I really got a lot of comfort out of those meetings because it gave me an insight into that world of research, and I actually felt like they didn't need me. They were doing such a great job, and while I'm really happy to give my perspective if it's wanted, yeah, I felt really confident in the work that they were doing.
Thanks, Leana. Yeah, that's right. So I think now we're going to go on to the Q&A, and I'm going to sort of start out with a few questions, and some people have already sent in some questions, and I'm assuming there might be some on the Teams. So this is an open one to anybody on the panel. So in your opinion, what does the consumer voice mean, not just for the hospital service, but for research?
I can speak to that if you like. I think it really puts that person in that role. So you're at your computer, you're looking at all this data, and it can feel really abstract. And if you've got that person in mind, or you've created a relationship with someone, it gives a little bit more meaning and a little bit more purpose to what you're doing. And I think it could feel more fulfilling and more rewarding at the end.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it, and it's building the relationship. All right, if a researcher was thinking of involving a consumer in a research project, what do you think is an appropriate way to do that? If you'd like to respond.
I'm happy to talk to that. So there's a few different ways that you can do that. Obviously, if you're a clinician and you have some patients that you see regularly, you might know of one who has the time and the interest to be able to be involved. The right way, well, maybe not the right way, but the way that we like to look at it is you need to find somebody who's got a constructive way of thinking. So you don't necessarily need someone who's had just the worst journey ever and only wants to make it better and make sure that nothing ever happens the same way it happened to them, because they become quite driven and focused on their own story. Sometimes it's better to be able to find somebody who hasn't necessarily had a great time of it, but is aware of ways that things can be done better. You know, you always want somebody around the table that's not just telling you about what's wrong, but what are the opportunities to make it better. You also need to make sure that you find somebody that's at the right time in their journey. So sometimes you need to be able to just let the past go so that you can move forward and help others to make things better. So you need to make sure that you've got somebody who's at the right part of their life to be able to have input. And if you don't think that you know anybody who could possibly help you, there are organisations out there like the WA Health Translation Network with their Consumer and Community Involvement Program, whose job is to recruit for you, to find consumers that can work within your team. And a lot of institutions nowadays have those sorts of services available to you, and it's potentially something that I can help for people working through the Royal Perth Bentley Group. But I know Curtin University has their own involvement program where they can find people for you. The Telethon Kids Institute is another one that has a terrific program that's been running for many years. But you know, asking around and seeing if you can find people is generally the best way to go. And then having that conversation with the consumer about whether they would like to be involved, because sometimes, as I said, it's just not the right time or you know, in their lives.
Thanks very much, Ben. And if I can ask a supplementary question to that one, is there any training of consumers? So, for example, Leana, when you joined the Sepsis network, was any sort of training provided to you?
No, I think they're just happy to have you. There's no screening process. No.
There is training available. As I said before, the Consumer and Community Involvement Program provides training. I know that the Telethon Kids Institute has training programs as well. This is for consumers, not necessarily for researchers. And there's some online things around as well that can help consumers to understand what research is all about. But to be honest with you, the training that they've had to be able to add value to your work comes from the lived experience that they've had. So I'm not a trained doctor, but I've lived in the health industry for 51 years, so I know a little bit about it without actually having any formal training whatsoever. And sometimes that's the experience that's more valuable than actually knowing how research works. Sometimes you just want somebody who's just living it every day. So sometimes the training can be useful, and some consumers want to have some training behind them, but I don't think it's necessarily.
Thanks, Ben. All right, another question. Should we provide our feedback in our research outcomes to our consumers in completion of the research? And if so, what are the common methods to do so? Would you like to tackle that?
Yes.
That's a yes question.
But do you have any suggestions on what might be the best way to do that?
Talk to what we did. So with the proof of concept and for the co-hive, what we did after that was create sort of a flyer that displayed like the results in a nice, easy to read way. And we presented that to CCG group to look over. They provided some advice on sort of any terminology that we could have changed or ways to make it even easier to read. And that was sort of a nice way for us to share like our progress and our findings from that part of the project and sort of acknowledge like that their help was beneficial. We did find these really good findings, and we did all this work with them to sort of show the outcomes of that as well was really important.
I think just to add to that, there's one other thing that we don't do very well either, and that's write about how consumers had a role to play within our projects in our journal articles that we end up publishing. As Dan has mentioned, some journals like the British Medical Journal, you need to demonstrate you've got a consumer in your team before they will look at your article. But I was involved in a project that analysed a lot of those articles, particularly around musculoskeletal health and arthritis, which obviously I'm close to, and less than 5% of them had any content within their article around what the consumers did and how it influenced the work in any possible way, which I think is a massive gap. If we're going to get better at doing this, we need to share our stories with each other, and we need to help influence the way we do this going forward. And if we're just ticking the box to say, yep, we've got consumers involved and we did what we needed to do to get the money, but then we forget about it going forward, then we're not actually getting the value that we should be.
That's a good point, Ben, and of course all the researchers will immediately think about word count limits. So there's always this tension between trying to provide that information, providing the results and methods, and fitting it within the constraints of what the journal says. So it can be challenging, but it's certainly something to aspire to.
Yeah.
All right, next question. If a project is observational and patients are incapacitated, how do we engage in consumer involvement when that involvement happens usually after discharge from, for example, the intensive care unit?
Well, I think I can talk a bit because this is our sort of bread and butter, if you like. So I think there's a couple of things there. I think reading behind the question, there might be sort of two separate issues there. So I think one of them is around, so obviously when we're talking about consumer involvement in research, we're talking about involvement in the design of the research project and involvement as a member of the research team. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that was crucial with my own clinical trial I'm currently running is getting that approved as a comparative effectiveness trial with enrolment under a waiver of consent, was being able to demonstrate that we had the support of our consumer group and that this was actually considered a reasonable thing to do. Obviously, then comes down to the practical issue, and again, depending on the different jurisdiction you are in Australia, but obviously there's good provisions within the NHMRC national statement about the circumstances where it is ethical to involve someone into research who is unable to consent, and then depending on the nature of the research, there may be a requirement for consent to continue or an opt-out consent process depending on the local jurisdictional requirements. And we have our own particular Western Australian criteria that we have to meet to do that. But again, I think it's actually all the more reason why we need to be actually involving our consumers, because ensuring that our what we're doing is we're transparent and that we're able to withstand scrutiny about for many people the idea of research creates some connotations that potentially for people who are not informed, might be a bit concerning that we're doing this without consent. But when you actually have conversation and discussions, particularly when this is observational or comparative effectiveness research of things that we do every day anyway, then involving the consumers is actually really really critical in this type of research actually.
And look, if I can just add a bit further to that, what it points to is that if you're a research group or a research leader, you need to work and establish those relationships. So you've already got a consumer involvement as just part of your research group. And then when you're designing an observational study or whatever, you can involve them in the design of the study and they can give their perspectives, even though no patient that you are looking after prospectively will ever be able to contribute, by way of the example, because they're ventilated in intensive care, but you've still involved consumers in research. And so I'm assuming in that environment there are intensive care consumer groups or lived experience groups, but it's sort of the role of, I think, of the research leaders to get that ball rolling. Rather, it's not something that a junior researcher just starting out can do. I think it's part of research leadership is to get that happening and established.
And we have, certainly the Royal Perth Bentley Group, we have a consumer advisory committee, and we have a lived experience advisory group focused on mental health issues. I know the Armidale Kalamunda groups have consumers linked to them as well. So if you're looking for an opportunity to connect with consumers who are aware of the systems within our hospitals and you want to talk to them about a what if situation, they're always available to be able to provide some feedback.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, next question. Are there any models, frameworks or additional reading references you recommend?